mentioned we're in a big bubble. Can you elaborate on that, and how is this likely to play out?
Well, I think eventually there'll be considerable trouble because of the wretched excess. That's the way it's usually worked in the past. But when it's going to come and how bad it will be, I can't tell you.
His question is, do you think it's likely that we will experience a major increase in interest rates in the upcoming decades, like, for example, in the period between 1950 and 1980?
Well, that, of course, is a very intelligent question and a very difficult question. When you throw money, when you print money on the scale that modern nations are printing it, Japan, the United States, Europe, etc., we're getting into new territory in terms of size. The Japanese bought back not only a lot of their own debt, but a lot of their common stocks. So the Federal Reserve System, you can't imagine how much money printing Japan has done. They haven't had all that much inflation, and it's still a very admirable civilization. In fact, you could argue that Japan is one of the more admirable civilizations in the whole world. And in spite of all this very extreme government money printing they've done, and they haven't had terrible consequences. Now they've had 25 years of stasis with living standards not improving very much. I don't think that came from their macroeconomic policies. I think that came from the rise of tough competition for their export powerhouse from China and Korea. But at any rate, it's weird what's happening, and nobody knows for sure how it's going to work out. I think it's encouraging that Japan can print as much money as it has and remain as civilized and calm and admirable as it has. And so I hope to God the United States has similar happy outcome. But I think the Japanese are better adapted for stasis than we are. I think it's a duty-filled, civilized bunch of people. A lot of them older, not many young people. And they just suck it in and cope. In our country, we have terrible tensions. It's way harder to run a country which is not mono-ethnic like Japan. It's way harder to run a nation like the United States with different ethnicities and groups and so forth than it is to run Japan. Japan is basically sort of a mono-ethnic civilization which is proud of its ethnicity, and of course they can cope with the troubles better than some other people can.
Charlie, Steve
But
Coswell,
we don't know where we're going. There's never been anything quite like what we're doing now, and we do know from what's happened in other nations, if you try and print too much money, it eventually causes terrible trouble. And we are closer to terrible trouble than we've been in the past, but it may still be a long way off. I certainly hope so.
On this same subject, he says, what are your current thoughts on the inflationary environment? And please compare and contrast it to the 1970s.
Well, when Volcker, after the 70s, took the prime rate to 20% and the government was paying 15% on its government bonds, that was a horrible recession. Lasted a long time, caused a lot of agony. And I certainly hope we're not going there again. I think the conditions that allowed Volcker to do that without interference from the politicians were very unusual. And I think in 2020 hindsight, it was a good thing that he did it. I would not predict that our modern politicians will be as willing to permit a new Volcker to get that tough with the economy and bring on that kind of a recession. So I think the new troubles are likely to be different from the old troubles.
Have you
think of all the Latin American countries that print too much money. They get strongmen and so forth. That's what Plato said happened in the early Greek city-state democracies. One person, one vote, a lot of equality, and you get demagogues, and the demagogues lather up the population, and pretty soon you don't have your democracy anymore. I don't think that was a crazy idea on Plato's part. I think that accurately described what happened in Greece way back then, and it's happened again and again and again in Latin America. We don't want to go there. At least I don't.
To this question about crypto that Benjamin writes in, He says in 2007 at the USC Law School, Charlie said, "I'm not entitled to have an opinion on this subject unless I can state the arguments against my position better than the people who are supporting it." The question is, does this also apply to your Wall Street Journal article on banning cryptocurrencies? And if yes, would you care to share the arguments against your position?
Well, I don't think there are good arguments against my position. I think the people that oppose my position are idiots. I don't think there is a rational argument against my position. This is an incredible thing. Naturally, people like they run gambling casinos where other people lose. And the people who invented this crypto crappo, which is my name for it, and sometimes I call it crypto crappo and sometimes I call it crypto shit. And it's just ridiculous that anybody would buy this stuff. That isn't. You can say hardly nothing on earth that has done more good to the human race than currency, national currencies. They were absolutely required to turn man from a goddamn successful ape to modern successful humans in human civilization. That enabled all these convenient exchanges. So if somebody says, I'm going to create something that sort of replaces the national currency, it's like saying I'm going to replace the national air. You know, it's asinine. It isn't slightly stupid. It's massively stupid. And of course, it's very dangerous. Of course, the governments were totally wrong to permit it. And of course, I'm not proud of my country for allowing this crap, what I call the crypto shit. It's worthless, it's no good, it's crazy, it'll do nothing but harm, it's antisocial to allow it. And the guy who made the correct decision on this is the Chinese leader. The Chinese leader took one look at crypto shit and he says, not in my China. And boom, well, there isn't any crypto shit in China. He's right and we're wrong. No. Well, there is no good argument on the other side. I can't supply it.
So does that counter what you said back at USC? That you shouldn't have a position unless you counter?
I do think you ought to be able to state on a lot of issues. How big should the social safety net be? That's a place where reasonable minds can disagree. And you should be able to state the case on the other side about as well as the case you believe in. But when you're dealing with something as awful as crypto shit, it's just unspeakable. It's an absolute horror, and I'm ashamed of my country that so many people believe in this kind of crap, and the government allows it to exist. It is totally, absolutely crazy, stupid gambling with enormous house odds for the people on the other side. And they cheat in addition to cheating and like betting. And it's just crazy. So that is something that there's only one correct answer for intelligent people. There is just totally avoid it and avoid all the people that are promoting it.
Given the increasing rate environment, what are the ramifications of moving away from a close to zero interest rate policy? Warren and yourself have frequently spoken about Aesop and a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush to describe the essence of investment decision making. So what do you do now that the interest rate environment is changing?
Well, there's no question about the fact that as the interest rates have gone up, it's hostile to stock prices. But they should go up. We couldn't have kept them forever at zero. And I just think it's just one more damn thing to adapt to in investment life is that there are headwinds and there are tailwinds. And one of the headwinds is inflation. And I think more inflation over the next 100 years is inevitable, given the nature of democratic politics in a democracy. So I think we'll have more inflation. That's one of the reasons the Daily Journal owns securities instead of government bonds, owns common stocks instead of government bonds.
When you say the nature of democratic policies, and I forget exactly how you worded it, are you talking about the Democratic Party? Are you talking about democracy as a whole?
No, listen to that. Trump ran on debt that was bigger than the Democrats did. All politicians in a democracy tend to be in favor of printing the money and spending it. And that will cause some inflation over time. It may avoid a few recessions too. It may not be all bad, but it will do more harm than good, I think, from this point forward.
Economic theory argues that excessive monetary and fiscal stimulus over the last 2 years has triggered the highest inflation in 40 years. Do you broadly agree with this thesis? And more importantly, do you think there will be a high economic price to pay as the Fed attempts to bring inflation back under control? I guess the reasons for it.
Well, the first part, I agree with it. We've done something pretty extreme, and we don't know how bad the troubles will be. Whether we're going to be like Japan or something a lot worse. And what makes life interesting is we don't know how it's going to work out. I think we do know we're flirting with serious trouble. I think we also know that some of our earlier fears were overblown. Japan is still existing as a civilized nation, in spite of unbelievable excess by all former standards in terms of money printing. Think of how seductive it is. You have a bunch of interest-bearing debts, and you pay them off with checking accounts, which you're no longer paying interest. Think of how seductive that is for a bunch of legislators. You get rid of the interest payments, and the money supply goes up. It seems like heaven. And, of course, when things get that seductive, they're likely to be overused.
What's the best advice you have for individual investors to optimally deal with the negative impact of inflation other than owning quality equities?
Well, it may be that you have to choose the least bad of a bunch of options. That frequently happens in human decision-making. And the Mungers have Berkshire stock, Costco stock, Chinese stocks through Lilu, a little bit of Daily Journal stock, and a bunch of apartment houses. Do I think that's perfect? No. Do I think it's okay? Yes. I think the great lesson from the Mungers is you don't need all this damn diversification. That's plenty of it. You're lucky if you've got 4 good assets. The finance professors that sell the idea that perfect diversification is professional investment. If you're trying to do better than average, you're lucky if you have 4 things to buy. And to ask for 20 is really asking for egg in your beer. It's very few people have enough brains to get 20 good investments.
We're headed to higher interest rate costs on top of our $30 trillion in debt. Today, interest comprises 6% of our spending, and the potential to double or triple interest expense is only going to make the problem worse. How can we get the public, companies, and politicians to recognize the seriousness of this problem and begin to take action?
Well, because all those problems are real, and because it's so tempting to get rid of your debt by just giving a guy a non-interest-bearing checking account where you used to have to pay him interest every month, not only do we have a serious problem, but the solution to it that is the easiest for the politicians and for the Federal Reserve, too, for that matter, is just to print more money and solve the temporary problems that way. And that, of course, is going to have some long-term dangers. And we know what happened in Germany when the Weimar Republic just kept printing money. The whole thing blew up. And that was a contributor to the rise of Hitler. So all this stuff is dangerous and serious. And we don't want to have a bunch of politicians just doing whatever is easy on the theory that it didn't hurt us last time, so we can double it and do it one more time. And then we double it again and so forth. We know what happens on that everlasting doubling. You will have a very different government if you keep doing that enough. And so you're flirting with danger somewhere unless there's some discipline in the process. But I don't regard Japan as in some terrible danger. I mean, they've done a huge amount of this and gotten by with it. I don't think we'll be as good at handling our problems as Japan is.
Should we continue to maintain a debt limit, The adjustment process seems to be a very simple and mechanical process. However, such a measure only seems to create an environment rife with political jockeying and sniping. What's the purpose if we continue to budget beyond our means and then the bill comes due?
Well, if you take the history of democracy in the world and go back far enough, it fails a lot and gets succeeded by dictatorships and all kinds of awful things. And as a matter of fact, the worst thing that happened to the human race in my lifetime was when an advanced civilization like Germany was taken over by a dictator as awful as Adolf Hitler. That happened as a consequence of a big worldwide depression. It would never have happened if we hadn't had the big depression. And once Hitler got in, that meant World War II was inevitable. And that could have worked out a lot worse than it did for the people like the United States. So these things are quite important. And they're not going to be done perfectly in the future, no more than they were done perfectly in the past. So of course, you got to expect a certain amount of future trouble in the world, and your government's going to do some things that aren't exactly right. On the other hand, I would argue that the U.S. government did some things magnificently right. I have said on many an occasion that the thing that makes me proudest of my own government is the way we handled the sequel to World War II. Instead of punishing the Germans and the Japanese, we made them into some of our best friends on earth. Now that was a stunt. And it was to the credit of our country that was done. And it was done on a bipartisan basis. And I think we can all be proud of that. That was a smart thing to do. It took some generosity. We had to give up some of our money to help them rebuild. And it was a credit to our species that we behaved that well on that occasion. And I don't think our future behavior will lack similar episodes of some kind.
Will lack similar episodes, or will have?
Some things very right and some things very wrong. That's the way it happens.
Yeah, that's very Churchill-esque, right? They'll try everything, all the wrong things until we do the right thing.
No, I will keep doing both wrong and right as far ahead as you can see.
Writes in from Chicago and wants to know if you think we might have on and off waves of inflation like we did prior to when Volcker stepped in at the Fed.
Of course it will happen some in the future. Yes, I think we'll have some of that in the future.
Do you think we'll have it immediately, right now, with what the Jay Powell's dealing with?
I don't regard myself. I think I'm pretty good at long-run expectations, but I don't think I'm good at...
Different countries in history. What should a good government do and not do for economic growth?
Well, all you've got to do if you want growing GDP per capita, which is what everybody should want, you've got to have most of the property in private hands, so that most of the people who are making decisions about how property is to be cared for own the property in question. And that makes the whole system so efficient that GDP per capita grows. In a system where you have easy exchanges due to a currency system and so on. And so that's the main way of civilization getting rich, is having all these exchanges and having all the property in private hands. If you like violin lessons and I need your money, when we make a transaction, we're gaining on both sides. So of course GDP goes like crazy when you got a bunch of people who are spending their own money and owning their own businesses and so on. And nobody in the history of the world that I'm aware of has ever gotten from hunter-gathering to modern civilization except through a system where most of the property was privately owned. There's a lot of freedom of exchange. And by the way, I just said something that's perfectly obvious, but isn't really taught that way in most education. Even if you take a course in economics in college and not know what I just said, they don't teach it exactly the same way. Anyway.
That would be your best suggestion. Yeah. What worries you most about our economy and stock market? And on the other hand, what makes you optimistic?
Well, you have to be optimistic about the competency of our technical civilization. But there again, it's an interesting thing. If you take the last 100 years, 1922 to 2022, most of modernity came in that 100 years. And in the previous 100 years, that got another big chunk of modernity. And before that, things were pretty much the same for the previous thousands of years. Life was pretty brutal and short and limited and what have you. No printing press, no air conditioning, no modern medicine, no. I don't think we're going to get things that were in what I call the real human needs. Think of what it meant to get, well, say first you got the steam engine, the steamship, the railroad, and a little bit of improvement in farming and a little bit of improvement in plumbing. That's what you got. The next 100 years gave us widely distributed electricity, modern medicine, pharmaceuticals, the automobile, the airplane, the records, the movies, the air conditioning in the South. And think what a blessing it was. If you wanted 5 children, if you wanted 6 children, if you wanted 3 children, you had to have 6 because 3 died in infancy. That was our ancestors. Think of the agony of watching half your children die. It's amazing how much achievement there's been in civilization in these last 200 years, and most of it in the last 100 years. Now, the trouble with it is that the basic needs are pretty well filled. In the United States, the principal problem of the poor people is they're too fat. That is a very different place from what happened in the past. The past, they were on the edge of starving. And what happens is, it's really interesting, is with all this enormous increase in living standards and freedom and diminishment of racial inequities and all the huge progress that has come, people are less happy about the state of affairs than they were when things were way tougher. And that has a very simple explanation. The world is not driven by greed. It's driven by envy. The fact that everybody's 5 times better off than they used to be, they take it for granted. All they think about is somebody else has having more now, and it's not fair that he should have it and they don't. That's the reason that God came down and told Moses that you couldn't envy your neighbor's wife or even his donkey. I mean, even the old Jews were having trouble with envy. And so it's built into the nature of things. It's weird for somebody my age, because I was in the middle of the Great Depression when the hardship was unbelievable. I was safer walking around Omaha in the evening than I am in my own neighborhood in Los Angeles after all this great wealth and so forth. So, and I have no way of doing anything about it. I can't change the fact that a lot of people are very unhappy and feel very abused after everything's improved by about 600%, because there's still somebody else who has more. I have conquered envy in my own life. I don't envy anybody. I don't give a damn what somebody else has. But other people are driven crazy by it. And other people play to the envy in order to advance their own political careers. And we have whole networks now that they want to pour gasoline on the flames of envy. I like the religion of the old Jews. I like the people who are against envy, not the people who are trying to profit from it. But if you stop to think of the pretentious expenditures of the rich. Who in the hell needs a Rolex watch so you can get mugged for it? Yet everybody wants to have a pretentious expenditure, and that helps drive demand in our modern capitalist society. My advice to the young people is don't go there. The hell with the pretentious expenditure. I don't think there's much happiness in it. But it does drive the civilization we actually have. And
Jerry Miller
drives the dissatisfaction. Steve Pinker of Harvard is one of our smart modern academics. he constantly points out everything's gotten way well better. But the general feeling about how fair it is has gotten way more hostile. And as it gets better and better, people are less and less satisfied. That is weird, but that's what's happened.